Hello, welcome back to the Economic Story Channel. In previous podcast episodes, we learned about the Great Depression, a decades-long crisis starting in 1929, when Americans shot themselves in the foot with a series of consecutive mistakes. In today's podcast, we continue to explore how the economy functioned in the 1950s, after the end of World War II, when policymakers applied John Maynard Keynes' economic theory to help the U.S. and global economies escape the Great Depression of 1929, which had lingered for decades. With the outbreak of World War II, nations spent enormous sums on military efforts. This pushed industries and human resources to operate at full capacity to serve the war effort. All these factors created an ideal environment for John Maynard Keynes' economic theory to take effect. However, as the war ended, and the economy stabilized, with people across all social classes becoming wealthier, the world faced a critical question. After Keynes' economic theory helped the economy recover from the Great Depression, what should the world do next to maintain sustainable and stable growth? The answer is certainly not to keep running the economy solely through government spending measures, as we discussed in previous podcasts. Excessive spending could lead to inflation and ultimately push the economy back into recession. Therefore, understanding how the small components of the economy operate is not only necessary, but also crucial for ensuring long-term sustainable and stable development. This is where Paul Samuelson, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, emerged with his groundbreaking contributions to economic theory. Samuelson, born in 1915 and passed away in 2009, was renowned for his ability to harmoniously combine John Maynard Keynes' macroeconomic theory with microeconomics principles from classical and neoclassical economics, drawing inspiration from Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics, with his 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations. Additionally, Samuelson incorporated ideas from David Ricardo, a neoclassical economist famous for his 1817 work, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. From these legacies, Samuelson developed a more comprehensive economic theory system. So, what exactly makes Samuelson's economic theory special? To answer this, let me share a few interesting stories where his big ideas come to life in the most accessible way. First, imagine you're playing a city-building game. You want everyone in the city to have jobs, stores stocked with goods, and every family to have a place to live. But suddenly, the game crashes. Many people lose their jobs, prices of goods skyrocket, and some areas run out of food. What would you do? This is the question Paul Samuelson sought to answer, not in a game, but in the real world. Regarding macroeconomics, what was Samuelson's vision? Macroeconomics is often understood as the overall management by the government. Paul Samuelson built upon the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, who wrote the seminal work The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Keynes argued that the free market, praised by Adam Smith with his invisible hand, failed to resolve this crisis. Samuelson agreed that the government must intervene to pull the economy out of crisis and recession. At the same time, the government must create a favorable environment to reduce unemployment to the lowest possible level, achieving a state close to full employment. He argued that leaving the market to self-adjust, as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and classical or neoclassical economists believed, could lead to prolonged unemployment and persistent economic recession with no clear end. To help you visualize, think of a car speeding down a highway. Without a driver, the car can still move forward due to momentum. This is Adam Smith's classical economic theory with the invisible hand. But when it encounters a sharp turn or obstacle, such as a recession or unemployment, you need a skilled driver to steer. According to Keynes and Samuelson, the government is that driver. However, Samuelson didn't just agree with Keynes' theory. He recognized that to address major issues like unemployment or recession, we need a deeper understanding of how the small gears in the economy operate. These small gears are the businesses, consumers, and individual behaviors within the economy. These small gears start creating movements that influence the large gears. which represent the overall development of the economy. Therefore, to explain how these small gears function in the economy, what academic finance calls microeconomics, Samuelson turned to classical and neoclassical economic principles. He built on Adam Smith's ideas of supply and demand and the invisible hand. He explained that individuals and businesses in a free economy automatically adjust their behavior to achieve collective benefits. He also drew on David Ricardo's in-depth analysis of human behavior, from the theory of comparative advantage to factors influencing business and individual decisions. This combination allows Samuelson to not only explain how the macroeconomy operates, but also clarify microeconomics factors, the decisions, and behaviors of businesses and consumers that impact the entire economy. Ultimately, after synthesizing the essence of John Maynard Keynes and classical economists, in 1948, Paul Samuelson published Economics, an introductory analysis. This was not just an economics textbook, but a classic work where he introduced the aggregate supply and demand model. This tool has become familiar to economic policymakers, from governments to major organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and even economics students today who study and research theory extensively. Samuelson's aggregate supply and demand model was a breakthrough, linking macroeconomics with microeconomics, clarifying the relationship between national output, inflation, unemployment, and the behaviors of businesses and consumers. So, what does the aggregate supply and demand model mean for economic policymakers, and how did they apply it in practice? First, let's understand what aggregate demand and aggregate supply are. Textbook concepts can be overly academic and confusing, so let me simplify. Demand refers to need. Aggregate demand is simply the total of all human needs in the economy combined. Here, needs refer to goods or services people spend money to buy. Samuelson described aggregate demand with this formula. Aggregate demand, AD equals C, plus I plus G plus XM, where C is household consumption, I is business or individual investment, G is government spending, and XM is exports minus imports. Aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services an economy can produce in a given period. The formula for aggregate supply isn't as simple or fixed as aggregate demand, as it depends on many complex factors and variables. These factors include labor costs, raw material prices, labor productivity, production technology, production scale, and more. Generally, these are the variables often used and mentioned today. Labor costs, such as wages and insurance, and raw material prices, like oil, metals, or food, are critical factors affecting aggregate supply. When labor costs or input prices rise without a corresponding increase in productivity, production costs increase. As a result, aggregate supply decreases because higher product prices make production more expensive. Conversely, labor productivity, technology, and production scale are key factors that boost aggregate supply. When labor productivity increases, businesses can produce more without increasing costs. Technological advancements reduce production costs and improve efficiency, while expanding factories or increasing capital investment enhances production capacity. All these factors significantly increase aggregate supply. In short, aggregate supply depends on production efficiency and costs. Any factor that improves productivity or reduces costs helps aggregate supply grow. So back to the 1950s. How did Paul Samuelson's addition of variables to the aggregate supply and demand model help the economy? And how did governments use this model to manage it? At this point, those paying close attention might notice that the formula for aggregate demand looks strikingly similar to the formula for calculating GDP using the expenditure approach. Indeed, studying and understanding macroeconomics can be complex, but it boils down to this simple insight. Before Paul Samuelson introduced the aggregate supply and demand model to modern economic theory, as we discussed in previous podcasts, GDP was first proposed in 1937 in a report to the U.S. Congress to address the Great Depression. It wasn't until after the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that GDP gained widespread recognition, becoming the standard for measuring a nation's economic strength and development. In summary, we studied to understand how economies functioned in the past. In reality, aggregate supply and demand are not calculated separately or regularly, or rather, they can hardly be calculated precisely. If they could be calculated as textbooks suggest, the Federal Reserve wouldn't need to hold endless meetings grappling with indicators like inflation, unemployment, and GDP. In the 1950s, modern indicators like CPI, unemployment rates, or detailed macroeconomic data weren't fully developed. Thus, policymakers and governments at the time had to rely on the aggregate supply and demand model to analyze and make policy decisions. In the 1950s, when GDP was already used to measure economic strength, if the government wanted to increase or decrease economic growth, it could simply rely on the formula and some basic calculations, right? But it's not that simple. Let me explain right now. Real GDP only grows sustainably when both supply and demand in the economy develop in balance. Simply put, producing more goods requires consumers to buy all those goods. Imagine a business produces a ton of goods and supply surges, but no one buys them. Where would all those goods go? Would they let inventory pile up and keep producing? Of course, not only a fool would do that. So, what happens when supply exceeds demand? The economy stalls, or worse, it plunges into a recession. This is exactly what happened during the catastrophic Great Depression of 1929, not unlike the overproduction crisis during the First Industrial Revolution. Machinery improved, goods were produced in abundance, but the poor had no money to buy them. The result? Goods piled up, production stalled, unemployment soared, and the economy collapsed. The cycle of businesses produce workers have jobs, workers have money to spending fuels production broke down. And so, the economy fell into a black hole of recession. See the problem? GDP growth is one thing, but balancing supply and demand is the eternal challenge. This is where the government steps in to manage the economy, boosting aggregate demand when needed and promoting aggregate supply when appropriate. It's not as easy as solving elementary math, is it? This is why Paul Samuelson developed the aggregate supply and demand model to enhance economic theory in the 1950s. He delved into analyzing the variables affecting each component of aggregate supply and demand. Specifically, aggregate demand, those components labeled C, I, G, and exports minus imports in the formula is influenced by variables like prices, interest rates, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. So, what are fiscal and monetary policies? So many technical terms, complex and hard to remember, right? To make it simple, think of your family. Imagine the wife manages daily spending, going to the market, buying this, and that she's the one handling fiscal policy. The husband manages the money, so he's the one handling monetary policy. It sounds prestigious, but here's the reality. A married man may earn money and handle it, but the irony is he can't spend it. His job is to earn it. Want to spend? He has to give it to the wife or ask her permission, and if she doesn't approve, he's stuck just looking at the money. These two must work in harmony to keep the family running smoothly. If the wife spends too much and the husband doesn't manage the money well by pulling some back into savings or investments, the family could end up drowning in debt. Conversely, if the husband holds the money too tightly, not spending enough for the wife to manage, the family will face internal conflicts. Am I right? Leave a comment. Husbands and wives, let me know. So for a healthy economy, a nation's fiscal and monetary policies must work in sync, like a couple who knows how to earn and spend wisely. Aggregate supply, on the other hand, is influenced by many variables, but key ones include production costs, labor productivity, technology, and input prices. Based on these unpredictable variables in the aggregate supply and demand model, Samuelson pointed out that addressing economic risks requires a more comprehensive approach. From this, he proposed the portfolio diversification model, a perfect blend of microeconomics, theory, individual choices, and macroeconomic theory, overall financial markets. Specifically, Samuelson advised that instead of putting all eggs in one basket, investors should allocate assets across different types to minimize the impact of unpredictable market fluctuations. For example, when stocks fall, bonds or gold may remain stable, balancing the portfolio's overall value. In summary, Samuelson's aggregate supply and demand model is a golden tool that helps policymakers stop guessing when managing the economy. Thanks to this model, they can clearly see the variables directly affecting the economy, enabling informed policy decisions. For instance, during a recession, stimulating demand is the solution, increasing government spending, lowering interest rates, or even printing more money. When demand exceeds supply, causing prices to soar, the priority is controlling inflation. The government can cut spending, raise taxes, or tighten credit to cool the market. The ultimate goal is to balance the supply and demand scales in the economy. Simply put, if supply increases and demand rises to absorb it, the economy grows healthily. But if supply grows and demand doesn't, businesses face excess inventory, cut production, unemployment rises, and the economy falls into recession. If demand grows but supply can't keep up, prices skyrocket, the currency loses value, and inflation pushes the economy into crisis. To better visualize the economic landscape of the 1950s, when John Maynard Keynes' theories had proven their usefulness, you might wonder, where does Paul Samuelson's economic theory fit in this picture? Think of it this way: GDP is like a broad portrait of the economy's health. It shows whether the economy is growing fast or slow, stable or unstable. But looking only at GDP doesn't tell you where the problem lies. Samuelson's aggregate supply and demand model is like a detailed scan of the body's organs. It helps economists examine every nook and cranny, from goods production and consumer demand to variables like prices, interest rates, fiscal or monetary policies, and how they interact. Thanks to this model, the government acts like an economic doctor, knowing when to prescribe stimulus to boost the economy or reduce it to cool inflation. Most importantly, the government must keep the supply-demand balance steady and growing. Only then will the economy stay healthy, avoiding sickness from recession or fever from inflation. After diving from theory to practice about how the economy operated in the 1950s, you've probably sensed the complexity yet fascination of those great economic minds. So, to make it less abstract and academic, let's dive into a concrete example to see how these theories play out in reality. Imagine a small town called Breadtown, where the economy revolves around a single product, bread. In 2024, the town's GDP is $1 million United States dollars, with aggregate supply producing 100,000 loaves of bread at 10 United States dollars each. On the chart, the aggregate supply curve as blue shows the relationship between bread production and the price producers are willing to offer. Aggregate demand from residents, businesses, and the government buys all these loaves. On the chart, this is the AD curve, green, showing the relationship between bread production and the price economic agents are willing to pay. The equilibrium point is where 100,000 loaves are produced at 10 United States dollars each. In summary, the 2024 GDP is 1 million United States dollars. The economy is stable and prices remain unchanged. However, in 2025, GDP rises. But there's a problem. You may have heard the difference between nominal and real GDP. In 2025, GDP rises to 1.2 million United States dollars, a 20% increase from 2024. Sounds appealing, right? But looking closer, issues emerge. Regarding aggregate demand, suppose the government printed more money and increased spending, causing demand to surge. This pushes bread prices from 10 United States dollars to 12 United States dollars per loaf. Regarding aggregate supply, suppose rising production costs, raw materials, fuel, or wages limit supply. So the town still produces only 100,000 loaves, despite higher prices. As a result, GDP grows, but bread production doesn't. This GDP growth comes solely from inflation. Price increases, not real growth. So, the big question of the 1950s was, after Keynes' economic theory helped the world escape the Great Depression, how do we maintain sustainable and stable growth? Paul Samuelson stepped in to answer this. What did Samuelson clarify? First, he emphasized that the government can't just focus on boosting aggregate demand through spending, as this will only drive up prices if supply doesn't change a phenomenon called demand pull inflation. Second, Samuelson warned that aggregate supply doesn't grow naturally. To increase real output, in Breadtown's case, the government needs to invest in new technology to make ovens work faster, expand infrastructure, build more ovens, and improve labor productivity by training people to bake better. Scaling this to the real economy, what's the practical lesson? The lesson is that if the government only focuses on heavy spending without improving production capacity, the economy will inflate due to rising prices, not real output to meet demand. This is like blowing up a balloon. It looks nice but can easily burst. Ultimately, Samuelson wanted the government to do what? He wanted the government to coordinate fiscal and monetary policies to balance aggregate demand and supply, investing long-term to not only address current needs, but also expand future production potential. The lesson from Breadtown: remember, GDP growth isn't always good. If it's just nominal GDP, it might be an inflation balloon. For real GDP growth, both supply and demand must be adjusted in harmony. The government is the head chef, ensuring the oven is ready, ingredients are plentiful, and bread is not only delicious, but enough for everyone. I hope this podcast has helped you understand how the economy operated from the 1950s to today, and how governments manage to keep things balanced. Those seemingly dry theories of Samuelson, Keynes, or complex economic models are actually the foundation for many policy decisions we see today. That's it for today's podcast. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you found this content useful, please share it with those who need it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to support and help the Economic Story channel reach more people. Thank you, and see you next time. See you.